Are you waking up in the middle of the night getting stressed about the level of global debt and its inability to generate economic performance?
I wouldn't say I was waking up at night, but I have to say it does feel as though the sort of utility function of monetary policy is running out, and the marginal effectiveness of their ability to continue to influence the sort of discount curve is quite concerning. I mean, an interesting dynamic we've seen in the last few weeks is this issuance of corporate bonds at negative yields as well. So to your viewer's point about how sustainable is negative interest rates, we're now seeing this creep into the corporate issuance space. So we've seen negative interest rates issued into 2 to 3 years in the corporate space, and zero coupon bonds up to 5 years. So that's a very interesting and concerning dynamic as well.
There is a view that the central banks have lost control, but there is also another view that actually some of these central banks are now allowing monetary conditions to tighten because they're interested in finding out what the consequences will be for asset prices. I just wonder where you sit on this, why you think we might see, why we're seeing yields going up a little bit at the moment.
Well, I think it's a very dangerous game. I think we know, investors know, and investors' reaction to tighter policy, or the implied tighter policy, is clear. It comes across as higher volatility. We're seeing reactions in the emerging markets. So just this expectation of the Fed and steeper yield curves triggering off high volatility and risky assets. So I don't really buy into the theory that central banks want to test the markets. I think ultimately you have to go back to the fundamentals. You have to see whether the economy itself is resilient or needs an increase of interest rates. And at this point, I still don't see it's a compelling argument at this point.
Do you not think we're coming to the end of the road in terms of the ability of central banks to buy certain assets? I mean, you know, what types of bonds can they buy without going further down the risk curve, which is not exactly where, if you look here in Europe, where many countries, where the mandate lies for the ECB, for instance, in Japan, how many pension funds, how many corporates really want the Bank of Japan to keep on doing what they're doing and going even riskier in the US? Not exactly on that page as they start to move away from zero interest rate policy. So if you look at the game of central banks and their ability to do more, I question whether the game is actually up, and whether that's why investors are now suddenly going, well, we've gone with you for so many years, but you haven't achieved what you said you were going to achieve, and we really do question the ammunition you have left.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point, that actually. I don't think, so there's this big conversation about whether the utility function, the marginal effectiveness of policy is there, and whether that is running out. I think the ability of central banks to expand their balance sheet and go into different asset classes down the risk curve is still there. It's just the appetite, whether they have the appetite to do that. But interestingly, to your point on pensions specifically, is the unintended consequence of this. Especially in the UK, we've seen recently with the collapse of bond yields and this sort of movement into the corporate space. Looking at defined benefits or the pension gap, you've seen yields collapse in long end gilts from 2.5% to 1%. You've seen an explosion of this funding gap as you've had the discount curve collapse, you've had the liabilities increase, but the disconnect between the performance of risky assets to this discount curve is running out, and I think that's the important point.